what's ruined journalism is they're not asking basic questions. And they're trying to shape narratives rather than ask basic questions.
So then, when you're at that age, you're like, why wasn't I told this stuff by my pastors and my Sunday school teachers? What are they? Maybe they're hiding something. That's the sinful. That's the old Adam and the devil speaking to you. Why didn't they tell you about this stuff? And I had no response to this stuff. And I ended up getting out of the course, dropping the course because I was like, I think I'm going to fall away from the Christian faith.
I believe with all my heart that the Scripture and the Confessions present historic apostolic Christianity full force, full proof. And it is a message that has an incredible learning curve. It's not easily accessible. But the technology exists now to have that message in the world where people get to hear the message of Christ crucified for sinners in its undiluted form.
Before we begin our episode today, we just want to take a quick moment to say thank you. We've had success that far surpassed our goals in this past year. And because of this, we are working on a new endeavor with Adam Kuntz and others, something we are just very excited about here. We are starting a Lutheran Institute of Theology, which will give you formalized courses in theological subjects ranging from church history to theological topics to how to read the Bible with some of the best minds in the Lutheran Church. Individuals like Adam Kuntz, Christian Preuss, other professors at our Concordias, and our seminaries. We're just extraordinarily excited to share this with you. So please check down in our description where you'll see a link to our new website that provides more information on what we're doing there for the Institute and how you can help support us. Again, thank you for your support, and now enjoy the episode.
We're live. We're here today with Jeff Schwarz, Todd Wilken. So a couple goals today, but the first one is just to understand kind of the backstory, which I understand it's a fascinating story, of Issues, Etc., which is, well, what's some of the numbers of Issues, Etc., just for probably most of our listeners understand what you do, but you guys are what, top 100 in...
We typically rank, it's a podcast and a radio talk show. We have a handful of terrestrial radio, and it's originally started out as a radio talk show before podcasting. I was hired, I think, in 1994 to produce Issues, Etc. As far as a podcast, it typically ranks in the top 100 in Apple Podcasts and Religion and Spirituality.
Which is wild from a Lutheran-centered podcast, right? Because we were looking at the numbers yesterday, and it's like 72 million Catholics in the U.S. and like 1.7 million Lutherans right now. So you look at like those numbers and the fact that something within the Lutheran Church makes it into the top 100 in a category with that kind of competition it's just astounding.
And it's labeled Lutheran Public Radio. So people know it says Issues, Etc. But if you look in any of the podcasts or Spotify, right underneath it's Lutheran Public Radio.
Yeah.
So it's Lutheran. It's not like the evangelicals. We have no idea, what kind of a Christian confession they have.
Pathfinder or whatever.
Right.
But the reason for that appeal is the guests. Because we have we draw guests from all over the map in terms of Christianity to speak to their area of expertise. We have people who listen to us who are not Lutheran, and Lutheran really isn't the appeal. For our core audience, Lutheran is the appeal. But for a broader audience, it has far more to do with the topics and the guests. And when they get a chance to listen to an expert guest in a long-form interview, they're going to listen to them wherever they find them. So I think that's the reason for the ranking, is because we and this is really to Jeff's credit, he just never stops beating the bushes every single day to get 2 hours of the very best interviews we can get. And that means best guests. So, there were days when we used to work for Synod and we were 3 hours every day from 3 to...
Tough.
Yeah. And we were doing a lot of open lines. That was back when you could open up phone lines and people would actually call in during drive time. That doesn't happen anymore. And we were trying to fill airtime. We are not trying to fill airtime anymore. We're just scheduling the best guests we have. And being independent and having our own place, our own studio, makes that possible because we can start recording 10 o'clock in the morning whenever we need to. We just record when the guest is able to record. And formatting those guests is why it's popular. That's what it is.
Yeah, and the tagline that really summarizes issues: expert guests, which Pastor Wilken mentioned, expansive topics. We cover a lot. The name is great. Issues, etc. It covers just about anything, right? Expert guests, expansive topics, extolling Christ. So that best summarizes issues, etc. But again, it originally started out as a terrestrial radio talk show, but now when we went independent after being canceled by the LCMS, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in 2008, we knew it was a podcast first, and terrestrial radio was on the decline, and that's proven out. The value of terrestrial radio stations, you could buy terrestrial radio stations here in St. Louis for less than $1 million, and it's just like newspapers. It's a very similar analogy, but originally it was a radio talk show.
But we got into podcasting at the very beginning of podcasting. It was not our idea. It was a colleague at KFUO who was a very driven guy who realized, oh, this is a whole new audience out there, and he realized that on demand was going to be. This is the day when you didn't have a DVR. You couldn't just watch television; you had to watch it live. And he realized this is the DVR of radio, so that you can listen whenever you want, wherever you want, doing whatever you want to do. So he got all of the programming into podcasting. And once we started looking at the numbers of the podcasting, we realized that this is the future. Well, terrestrial radio is not the future.
And before podcasting, there was Mark Cuban started broadcast.com. You guys are probably too young to even hear of that. It was basically a podcast, but it was just on the website. It was a broadcast.com website. So we got approached by Salem Communications. They own all the top radio stations in the country. They have the Family Talk channel on XM Sirius, like the even Christian. And we got approached like, hey, do you guys want to go on broadcast.com? It's like, sure. And I remember the late Paul McCain at Concordia Publishing House, run it by him. He goes, that's a great idea. So we would put up like, I don't know, it was like 10 hours or 12 hours, like a month. You could change the programs, like best of issues, etc. And you go to a broadcast.com website /issues etc. And I would look at those numbers, and this was even before podcasting. I'm like, well, it totally makes sense. You listen to what you want when you want to listen to it. So Cuban eventually sold off broadcast.com, but Todd's right. KFUO, when we were there, I mean, I think we were doing podcasts before Limbaugh and some of the big people. Podcasts.
The guy was Paul Clayton, and he saw the potential for it, and realized that was going to be the future of how people listen to talk. And now, that's how people listen to everything that they listen to.
Todd, if you can answer a question, and then I want to kind of back up and go back and say, okay, what's the early days like leading up to 2008, and kind of walk through the history of issues, et cetera. I think that you're, hundreds of thousands, millions of listeners over the, last 30 years. I'd be interested to hear that. But one thing you mentioned I'm interested to hear more of is the importance of you guys bringing in the best guest for the subject matter, rather than just saying, okay, let's find a Lutheran to talk about something, even if that's not their area of expertise. Because I think that's something that was probably defining for you.
Absolutely. And, yeah. I mean, that grew in my mind out of the fact that when we were working for Synod, we were a Sunday night national show. We had about, at the peak, 100
terrestrial stations. We were all over the country: Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Dallas.
Every
major
major
on
market.
XM Sirius satellite radio. We had a Sunday night nationally syndicated show, 2-hour show. We came on right before the White Horse Inn. They were also on Sunday night with Rod Rosenblatt and Ken Jones and Mike Horton. We came on 2 hours right before them on the same
network. And so that was the show that we were doing on Sunday nights. And you just don't sit a Lutheran pastor down for a conversation on something for that show. That's a bigger audience. And so because we were able to get expert guests from all over Christianity on that show, because you call them up and say, do you want to be on at 3:00 with Wilken for a local station? They're going to be like, no. Their publicist is going to be like, they don't have the time for that.
Mm-hmm.
You say, we want you on for an hour on Sunday night, and we're on 100+ affiliates. Then their person says yes.
Mm.
And so because we were able to get those guests, again, to Jeff's credit, then we were also able to lure them onto the weekday show occasionally. And that started this relationship with these people and their publicists and their secretaries and all the people you have to know to make this happen, that Jeff builds this enormous network so that when Al Mohler sees a posted on his desk that says Jeff Schwarz called, he's far more likely to say, oh, yeah. And, I'll use him as an example. We built such a good relationship with him through doing this that he just shows up at the radio station one day, just walks in.
Get a call. It's like, Jeff, there's somebody here to see you. It's like, who is this? What's your name again? Dr. Albert Mohler. In St. Louis. Like, what? Like, Todd. And I go, Todd, Mohler's in the lobby. he was in the area and just appreciated our interviews.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy is one of the top leaders in Christianity in America.
Mm-hmm.
Just to say hi and to meet us face to face.
A kingpin in the Southern Baptist Convention, and now a media personality. And I'll tell you another story about him. We were in Wittenberg in 2017,
the anniversary of the Reformation,
and broadcasting from the Luther School there. And I'm just out walking around, wasting time before we're supposed to go on, and here comes Mohler's wife out of a shop, and I recognized her from Facebook or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Al comes walking out behind her, and I said, Dr. Mohler, it's Todd Wilken. He's, oh, hi. We knew each other. And I didn't even think, oh, we got to get him on the show. He's here in town. But I went back and I told Jeff, I said, I just ran into Al Mohler. He's like, what, did you ask him to be on the show? I was like, no, I didn't even think about that. He seemed like he was kind of busy to me. But Jeff called his guy, and he came over and did the show.
So here we are, 500th anniversary of the Reformation, interviewing a Reformed Baptist about Martin Luther and the Reformation from the old Latin school in Wittenberg, Germany.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back, even before the Sunday night, Don Matzett was the original host of the show, Pastor Don Matzett. And he was a huge driving force behind issues, et cetera.
Should we bring this back into the early?
Yeah, let's go
kind
back.
of walk through it.
Don Matzett had been hosting it, I don't know how many months before I was hired. I had worked on nationally syndicated sports talk shows with Bob Costas, John Madden, Jack Buck, left the company. We started Offsides with Dan Deerdorf, who was the Monday Night Football color commentator, and Talking Around Ball, Dick Vitale. Convinced that guy to sell off. He wasn't a great business guy, to sell off that company. And so I'm not, I'm single, and somehow somebody at the LCMS heard about me. It's like, hey, you need to come work for us. Now, of course, my pride at the time, I work for some daytime, 5,000 watt AM station in St. Louis, Christian radio station. I was like, sinful pride at the time. So they said, so I wasn't interested, but this guy that worked there said, I want you to listen to this Don Matzett guy. Just listen to him.
Talent.
And Don Matzett was from Brooklyn, I think Brooklyn, somewhere in New York City. But if you were spinning across a dial, his voice stood out like nobody else's. It's like, this guy's got a gift. And
he had the bourbon and cigarette voice.
Yes.
That takes
and
years
New York.
And the attitude.
New York persona. And so I said, oh, okay. So I think I started out part-time, just see where this goes.
And the show was a public affairs show at the time. It was not theological in any.
Yeah. So
what's a public affair?
Well, it was more newsy. What the Synod
okay.
was trying to do at the time was, how do we how do we get an audience? They started what's called the Jubilee Network. A donor donated. There was a satellite dish outside the Synodical headquarters, and they were going to send up programming from KFUO for affiliates to pull it down all over the country. So, granted, this is hindsight, but you're not going to get on Christian radio unless you pay.
Mm-hmm.
You have to. Here's our rate card. There were people thinking, well, it'll be so good that they won't make us pay. Well, Jim Dobson, folks on Family's paying, and he's been paying for decades.
Mm-hmm.
That's not realistic. So we thought we'll just make it so we're going to hire this big time producer and all this stuff, and we'd have Cal Thomas and George Will and Peter Jennings and all these people on, but hardly any affiliates. So anyway, Matzett is a pastor, and it was very little theological. It was more left-hand kingdom, Christians in the culture kind of stuff. And I didn't really have an experience with that. I was in a sports talk show, but I knew how to get people in the secular realm. And he's like, there's really hardly any gospel in any of this stuff, you know? I was like, well, I'm just a layperson. I don't have connections. I definitely don't have connections in the theological realm.
Mm-hmm.
And so we agreed to make it half and half left-hand kingdom topics and guests and half right-hand kingdom topics. That's how it started out initially.
And Matzett's talent carried a lot of that. I remember I listened at the time. And when they started doing the theological stuff, because I was living in the area. And he could, and I knew Don from, I'd actually done some field work with him when I was in seminary. So I already knew him, knew what kind of guy he was. And he was no nonsense. And his personality came through the airwaves. He could project that personality into a camera because he did television in his earlier days, and he could project that personality through the microphone. And he could sit there and talk about the book of Romans, and I'd sit in it's the parking lot moment. I'd sit in the parking lot of a nursing home. I should be in there visiting the shut-in, and I'm listening to Don. And that's, you cannot teach that. You cannot learn that. That's just a gift that some people have of holding the audience, bonding with the audience. And Don had it in spades. So,
but when it came to the theological stuff, it's like, how are we going to get, I don't know anybody. So Don had written several books through Harvest House, an evangelical publisher. He got on the White Horse Inn with Mike Horton and Rod Rosenblatt and Ken Jones. And he's like, we need to do with these guys. So I was like a network marketing Amway salesman. Okay, well, we'll get Rod Rosenblatt on. And that's great. Rod, give me the names of 5 other people we got to give on. And so it literally became like network marketing. He's like, with Don. And then Don, before anybody in the LCMS, was big on Christian apologetics. And we took a lot of heat in the early years because you're saying you're reasoning people into the Christian faith. God's word doesn't need defense. And but Don was all over it. And so we'd have John Ankerberg on. And I mean, all the top, Bob and Gretchen Passantino, Hank Annegraaff. I mean, all the top, Craig Hawkins, who used to host the Bible Answer.
Greg Kokel.
Yeah, Kokel. And so we were really going in the apologetics realm hard.
What was the pushback you'd get for that?
Well, the pushback were LCMS pastors saying,
Lutherans don't do apologetics.
Really?
Things have changed a lot.
There's a Franz Pieper quote, something that I don't even know what it is. Do you know? Craig Parton's talked about it in his Christian Dogmatics, which seems to like downplay. It's God's word. It's efficacious. You don't need to defend it. It doesn't need defense. Just proclaim it, kind of thing.
So let me ask this:
we're talking about a previous era in Lutheran theology, because this has changed in the last.
Do you guys think that you were part of that change?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it wasn't because we were like, people loved it.
Yeah.
It was LCMS lay people weren't hearing this. They were like, well, if I share the gospel and they said Jesus didn't rise from the dead, what am I supposed to say? Well, I believe it, the faith. I have no argument.
And John Warwick Montgomery was a huge driving force I should say the late John Warwick Montgomery, was a huge driving force here because he was on the apologetics train in the 50s and the 60s. And so connecting to him, you get a world-class apologist who literally does this for a living, showing people how a Lutheran can do apologetics without falling into some sort of decision theology or, reasoning people into the faith. And then seeing it being done by other people in Christendom. And the audience was like, we've never heard this before. And the pastors who listened very reluctantly came along to.
That's some of the
that
older
position.
ones. I think what we always said, once the culture became more hostile to Christianity, I always said, you're going to be forced to do apologetics. I mean, so I think our younger pastors realize, as Aaron Wren says, we're living in a negative world. We're living in a post-Christian culture. Gene talks about that as well. So do we have any arguments when people push back a meme or something or other? We've published 3 books called Objections Overruled, which is chapters on Apologetics 101. It's all Lutheran apologists, the late Alvin Schmidt, John Warwick Montgomery, Angus Manouge in Concordia, Wisconsin, Adam Francisco, people like that. I mean, some of the top apologists are Lutheran people. And in the forward to that book, I went to, when I was in journalism school at the University of Missouri, I took a religious studies course, lifelong Lutheran, baptized, never missed church. Even at college, always went to the divine service. All of a sudden, I take this religious studies like, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. Look at all these discrepancies in the Bible and these manuscript variants. And I never heard this stuff. And so then, when you're at that age, you're like, why wasn't I told this stuff by my pastors and my Sunday school teachers? What are they? Maybe they're hiding something. That's the old Adam and the devil speaking to you. Why didn't they tell you about this stuff? And I had no response to this stuff. And I ended up getting out of the course, dropping the course, because I was like, I think I'm going to fall away from the Christian faith.
Wow, yeah.
But Don Matson gets a lot of credit. He was spearheading, we got to do apologetics.
Let me ask you this, because, the value of media, right? But it seems like, you're a pastor at a church, right, in the middle of wherever, and you're kind of going about your things, right? So you don't have a pulse on what kind of questions are the culture asking, right? And it seems like that's where the necessity of something like Issues, Etc., or anything that's media-based is it's an opportunity for wherever you're at to understand what are the broader questions and to get you plugged into that. Because it seems like at that point, you guys are recognizing, hey, apologetics is kind of necessary, right? Both in personal experience, but then also understanding the questions of the culture. And you might have got pushback from people that are in their area, or they're in a rural place in Missouri, something like that, right? And they're saying that's not necessary. But you changed the waves of the understanding at that time. So that is kind of a necessary step right now, would you say?
Yeah. And, lay people live in
The real world,
but they have their bubble in which they're confronting these things all the time, every day, especially now with the advent of social media. Pastors largely live in their bubble where they're not all the time. Some of that has changed with social media, but they're doing their thing. They're preparing their sermons. They're visiting their people. They're going to meetings, and no one's really asking hard questions or posing problems beyond the things they encounter pastorally. And so there's a dual appeal there because the lay people have all these questions, and the pastors don't have the time or the resources to bone up on all this stuff.
Yeah. In defense of pastors, I'll give you a really good example. We just sponsored a conference, a Necessary Masculinity conference at St. Paul Lutheran Hamel. Pastor Jeff Hemmer, author of the great book, Man Up, Concordia Publishing House. So he did a great job on a Lutheran view of masculinity. I'm lifelong Lutheran. If I didn't work with Issues, Etc., I never heard that. If I did, I had earwax. Now, a pastor has 15 minutes in a sermon on Sunday morning, maybe an hour Bible class. they can't become an expert on all these different issues, feminism or masculinity or critical race theory. They just can't. They don't have the time to do that. But what we can do, and what we have at that conference, Jeff Hemmers read Doug Wilson, read Nancy Pearcey's book, watch Andrew Tate's stuff.
Yeah.
Now, LCMS pastors can't keep up on all this stuff, but we can present guests like that to show people, no, there is a Lutheran worldview. There is a lens on how Lutherans should think and live. So it's not pastors' fault.
No.
They're preaching the text in front of them, and they literally have an hour and 15 minutes max. That's in how many people attend Bible class. Now you're talking 15 minutes. So you can't cover all these issues, but this is where we can. What we like to say is, we don't even call ourselves a ministry because we believe that's word and sacrament ministry. We provide artillery support for the church militant on the front lines.
So we're way
That's
back.
a good way to put it.
We're way back. We can't even see the front lines. And all we're doing is lobbying, and we stole this idea came from one of our listeners, but all we're doing is we're just lobbing artillery, into the enemy, and the pastors and the congregations are on that front lines. And that's why when Jeff says goodbye to, when we have a pastor on as a guest, he's always like, thank you for your faithful service on the front lines. We're just, what do you say?
Well, they're the real heroes.
Yeah.
You guys, the pastors are the real heroes, and the lay people are the real heroes. They're like, man, you guys take bold positions, critical race theory and stuff. We're in a studio.
I'm sitting in a studio.
With nameless, faceless people. That pastor has to sit to that young couple who's cohabitating. It's like, no, I'm not doing the wedding ceremony.
Yeah.
You repent. But we can talk about cohabitation, and we can talk about what God's word says about that, but we don't have the couple sitting in front of us. So all we can do is like, we've got your back. And so when that pastor, that those people are, I've never heard that before. Well, listen to this Issues Etc. show. These are some of our top theologians talking about exactly what I'm telling you right now.
And we've heard this from pastors repeatedly, where they'll talk to us or they'll visit the studio and they'll say, man, when I got out of seminary, I realized I was so far over my head on all this stuff. And they're just casting about for something, some resource. They find issues, etc. And they're like, it really has helped me because I had someone with a question about this. And I go to your website and I search, and there you have a guest talking about it. And that's really what we're doing. And this keeps the show on track because it focuses us on our listener. And this is just basic broadcasting 101, that if you are focused on your listener and asking the questions the listener has, then you're serving the listener. And that's why the show is the format it is. That's why it's interview. That's why I don't do a lot of, except when we do open lines, I don't do a lot of talking because my job is to ask questions and let the guests do the talking, because they're going to do a much better job than I'm going to do on this,
which is very rare in media, whether it's conservative talk radio. You got one person behind a microphone, but it's not guest driven. I mean, within the LCMS context, let's look at the Lutheran Hour. Since Walter A. Meyer was the original speaker, each speaker listenership drops. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. But when you have one person behind a microphone, no matter whether intentionally, and it's not intentionally, but unintentionally, there will be a cult of personality. You're going to bond to that person, right? With Issues, Etc., it's a guest-driven show. We're replaceable. I mean, we are literally replaceable. Because it's about expert guests.
As long as his network, someone can inherit his network of people and of contacts, then that's what Don Matchett used to say. A trained monkey could do what I do.
That's not true. I'll give Wilken a little props here. It's like my job becomes easy because the competition in Christian radio hosts is really bad.
Yeah.
Really bad.
Not just in Lutheranism. You're saying,
evangelical.
across the board.
It's superficial. They know nothing about church history.
They never read
know.
books.
They don't know the creeds. They're
literally taking the press package from the back of the book that has questions that have been written by the public.
Or they're trying to apply. R.C. Sproul comes on the doctrine of justification to the war in Israel, the Middle East or something, or it's like something timely, whatever the top thing is. So, but when they come on with Wilken, and Don Matz is the same way, they're like, now that was an interview. They were like, so it makes my job easier to get them back on the show. We stand out amongst all the hundreds of thousands of people asking to interview these people.
Is it because there's intellectual teeth to the conversation?
And he's a theologian.
Mm-hmm.
And
I read the books.
And he reads the books. And that's a rarity too.
I'll tell you this. So when we kind of started, one of the conversations, I kind of had a theory, and it was kind of based off of what I've seen from you guys, from people like Jordan Peterson and such. And it was that, no, we need to be very intellectual in these conversations, right? So get philosophical, dive deep. Don't try to have this kind of assumption like I need to speak to a freshman high school level, right? And some people had that opinion when we were talking. They said, make sure you don't get too deep or whatnot. So I said, okay, like we'll certainly we'll experiment, we'll experiment over the first year. And overwhelmingly, you could probably draw a graph. And the deeper the conversation, seminary professor talking, Bill Weinrich talking about John, something like that.
That's pretty deep.
Versus lighter conversations that, are more applicable. Someone that's more of a forest guy, and we kind of bounce to without a doubt, the view duration, the downloads, the likes, the more philosophical, the more intellectual it is. That's what people want.
Well, people are starving. The lay people are starving for theology. And this is something we realize. That's why one of our taglines is you can teach lay people theology.
They're very
That came from a conversation that we had with the program director at KFUO, where he said, you can't teach lay people theology.
Mm-hmm.
And
it wasn't the program director. It was an LCMS Inc. communications person.
Oh, it was a communication guy.
Yeah. And it said, Jeff, you can't teach lay. That was when Matt was still with the show. You can't teach lay people theology.
And Matt just like, watch me.
And Matt's drive was like, no, just sit back and watch.
Why do you think that idea was there? Because it seems to me that was a huge miss. And I think Jordan Peterson's the great exposure, because he goes, you listen to him talk, the vocabulary he uses, he's way deeper than we're getting on a Sunday sermon or anything like that. And he's selling out. He's selling out whole stadiums.
He's
of people
not
that want to
lowest
listen. Common
denominator.
Yeah.
And, he's a college professor who talks like a college professor.
Yeah.
But he also addresses the questions that ordinary people face every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And he does it in a very accessible way. He's a good communicator. I was not hot on him when he first started being popular, but I've changed my mind on that. And he's also intellectually open. So some people speculate, is this guy a Christian? Is he Christian adjacent? What is he?
Mm-hmm.
And what they're seeing, it's the same thing they see with Joe Rogan. It's an intellectual openness to ideas, even ideas that being a kind of college professor would sometimes institutionally make you very wary of, like Christianity.
Yeah, yeah.
You're going to be a skeptic more than anything. And he has that right balance of, I want to hear this idea all the way through, and I want to explore it, and that skepticism that he carries around with him. And it's absolutely the same thing with Joe Rogan, a guy not a college professor by any stretch of the imagination, but he wants to hear your ideas, and he wants to bounce them around. And in the process, he buys into a lot of very kooky stuff, which gives him a certain charm.
Yeah, yeah.
But people want answers to the questions he's asking.
Yeah.
And again, you don't teach that. I mean, this is a former actor and stand-up comedian who could have a career, and did, doing something else, has made his mark in American history, literally, has made his mark in American history just sitting in a studio asking smart people questions. And he follows up. If he hears an idea, it's again, broadcasting 101. If he hears an idea that interests him, he follows that, sometimes down the rabbit hole, but he'll follow it. And It's not a formula. It's simply he's a man who completely understands his audience because he is just an ordinary guy.
Yeah. And he's curious.
Yeah. And in that curiosity, people are thirsting for this because look at the media nowadays. This is their main problem isn't that they're liberal. It's that they're incurious. They just don't want to know. And that's built out of their political bias, but what's ruined journalism is they're not asking basic questions. And they're trying to shape narratives rather than ask basic questions. So,
and get back to you can't teach lay people theology. I think there's a lowest common denominator. You get too Lutheran on this. You mentioned how many few Lutherans there are in America, right? You get to, so, there's this, you start getting into details in the weeds, you're going to lose viewers or listeners. So I think that's part of what drives it. And Todd's heard this too. So a fundamental principle of marketing is appeal to the lowest common denominator. I get it. All right. The lowest, the biggest, broadest audience. But another fundamental principle that nobody in the mission list and the LCMS never want to talk about is like, you have to have a niche.
Yeah.
What's your niche?
Yeah.
I don't care how, we can appeal to the lowest common denominator and sound like pop American Christianity and maybe have a bigger, but we wouldn't have a bigger audience because why listen to you when I can listen to Rick Warren or anybody else, or Driscoll or what's the big guy, the big guy that Roseborough's always talking about now. I can't think of him. Anyway, I mean, we're going to do a poor man's imitation of it, right?
Yeah.
So, but you have to have a niche. So let's be bold with our confession. Let's don't dumb it down. But at the same time, we're not sectarian. If we've got, if we can bring on Ryan Anderson, a Catholic, to talk about transgenderism, and he's an expert and he's done his research, bring him on.
Yeah.
So we're not going to go off the other extreme either, where we're going to be sectarian.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's important. I mean, you guys had John D. Davidson on.
Yeah,
we did as well. And that had we got a huge boost from that, right? Yeah. And he's a Roman Catholic, Latin Mass Roman Catholic. Right. And he's talking about paganism, and he's talking about C.S. Lewis. And, we're talking about Tolkien and stuff like that. So he was a very articulate speaker, more than anyone I know in the Lutheran Church on that specific topic.
Right.
One, because he just did all of this research and published this book, so why not go get that? Or should I find somebody who's not as good at it, but they're Lutheran, even though we're not tackling like, baptism or the Lord's Supper or anything like that. We're talking about paganism and, the history of that, how it manifested in the Vikings and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's his expertise. Why not bring him on?
Right.
We get criticism from a small cadre of Lutheran pastors usually about having non-Lutheran guests, which to me is inconceivable, because if all we did was call up guys on the roster or lay people who are confessionally Lutheran, we would close our doors in less than a year because no one wants to hear that. What they want to hear from their pastors is good pastoral care, God's word rightly preached. That's what they want to hear from their pastors. Not that pastors can't be guests, that some of them are really fantastic guests. But the average person knows if I got a question about Scripture, I go to my pastor. If I got a question about how do I deal with this issue in politics, he's not the expert there.
Yeah,
and so the quality of our guests would be greatly diminished, and we would not be serving our listeners, because if you got a guy like he mentioned, Ryan Anderson, who saw this thing coming in terms of the transgenderism before a lot of people did, and was writing about it, studying it before many people were. You got a guy like that who's available to you and to your audience, you use them. And I'm not going to ask Ryan Anderson about transubstantiation, Mary, or even the Pope, although he'd probably be more honest about this Pope.
Yeah.
But we're not going to talk about that, not because I'm avoiding it, but it's because that's not his area of expertise.
Yeah.
He's a good guest who happens to be a Roman Catholic. And the same is true of Robert George. He's
Princeton University law professor.
Yeah, and he's a very good legal mind who happens to be a Roman Catholic. I'm not saying that it's merely coincidental. He's probably the brilliant mind he is because he's a Roman Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Roman Catholics have a tradition of great education. And so they've produced a lot of really great thinkers. And I remember this was way back in the day when, who am I thinking of, Jeff? Guy who started First Things.
Richard John Newhouse, Father Richard John, former LCMS pastor.
He was an LCMS pastor.
Yeah.
Who
on the show quite a bit.
Yeah, went to Rome. We used to have him on a lot. And he was kind of considered a traitor by a lot of Missouri Synod Lutherans.
Which he was.
And, he went to Rome. He went to Rome for reasons. I mean, he told me he was attracted to Rome because Rome had a more robust moral theology, and he was huge in the civil rights movement. And he's like, I just can't get Lutherans to think about this issue in moral terms. And he said the same thing about abortion. At the time, the LCMS was really weak on abortion. And he told me, I can't get Lutherans to think about this as a moral issue. And so he went where they would. And we would interview him on abortion. What else would we talk to him about?
Religious liberty.
Yeah, those kinds of things, because he was a nationally recognized intellectual authority. He was probably of the same caliber in the religious realm as whom I think of now, the name's escaping, the guy who founded National Review.
William F. Buckley.
Yeah, William F. Buckley. He's the names guy. I can never remember names.
Yeah, that's impressive.
But he was at that caliber of William F. Buckley in terms of speaking a moral voice in society, whereas William F. Buckley was kind of an intellectual voice in society. And we'd interview him, and I would come away from these interviews just completely humbled and just in awe that there were minds like that I actually got to pick this guy's brain for a half hour. And then we get a call from someone, why'd you have Newhouse on? Like, did you listen to the interview?
Yeah.
And I'd say, is there anything he said in that interview that you disagree with? No. Like, then what's the problem?
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it.
What is the problem? He's a gentleman. He's not going to chide me for being Lutheran or chide me for not praying to Mary.
Well, he's going to stay on the topic.
Yeah.
We don't like bait and switch people.
Yeah.
If we're going to talk about that topic, it's like, why didn't you ask Newhouse about the doctrine of justification by grace through faith alone? Because that's not what we're here to talk about.
Right.
Yeah.
And
you don't want to have to be that person either. Like your job isn't to get in a public debate with Newhouse about justification.
Right.
No. And even when we have quote unquote hostile interviews with people that we know.
For example, we like Robert Schuller, we've had on.
Okay.
Joyce Meyer, Tim LaHaye, Greg Laurie, Bart Ehrman a couple times, Bishop John Shelby Swung a couple times. So
what was the Joyce Meyer one like?
Well, that was interesting because Joyce Meyer's based here in St. Louis, so she knew who we were.
And she's a former Lutheran, too.
She was LCMS.
Yeah, she was. Oh, yeah, she's got a famous lines like, I was told I was a poor, miserable sinner that's alive from the pit of hell. So, and Don Matzit was really hard, and we were hitting Joyce Meyer hard because she's right in St. Louis, too, and she was really becoming big, growing at the time. We're talking mid-90s. So the only way you get a Joyce Meyer on, she's got a book out, okay? So this is pre-internet where publicists couldn't really do research. They knew we were Lutheran or whatever. Now, I didn't go all the way. He's like, we're just a Christian talk show in St. Louis, right?
Uh-huh.
So it was interesting. So you're literally, they're going like 15-minute interviews with the next person. Okay, now it's, KFUO.
They're sitting in a room taking one.
And Joyce Meyer. Well, I don't know if they said KFUO in St. Louis. Like, okay, Joyce is ready. And then she hears Todd's voice. And I mean, her whole countenance just like
Because you knew who Todd was.
Yeah. Because this is going to be 15 minutes. I really don't want to.
Yeah.
And of course, right away we play the cut about her. I'm not a poor, miserable sinner. But Todd's not debating her either. He talks about let the horse speak.
Yeah.
Okay. Explain
which
what you
can do more damage, right? Because in other words, like let people judge her on her own words. Yeah.
Exactly. And let her, and maybe we got you wrong.
Yeah.
And let her speak. And not that these things get a little testy at the end. I remember Robert Schuller. And Robert Schuller, same thing. We had 15 minutes. We were in a studio in Chicago because we were doing a remote Sunday night broadcast there. And we could only do it on a Friday or something. I can't remember why we had to use WYLL Chicago. And so you get these 15-minute book chat interviews, right? Well, the person behind us canceled. So we got a whole half hour. And I mean, he let Todd have it. It's like, you don't tell those people they're sinners, do you? You imagine the guilt and the shame that they have. I mean, he just
who was this?
Robert Schuller, the Hour of Power, Crystal Cathedral. You're too young.
Okay, yeah, I don't remember him.
He was the church growth of church growth.
He was
Rick Warren before Rick Warren.
Yeah, and he had
and Joel Osteen.
He had
an Hour of Power TV show Sunday mornings. Those all.
He was the big thing, and
so Todd. Sometimes they will get a little testy, but it's not that Todd's like, being snarky. He's just asking questions.
So you're just asking questions.
Yeah.
And rather than asking, they're getting frustrated. And
I'm asking him. And then on towards the end of the interview, I will say, this is what I preach on Sunday morning. And I just ask for his reaction.
Yeah.
I'm laying it out as it is, but I ask for his reaction. I distinctly remember him bawling me out. This guy who has the reputation of being the nicest man in America, was just the interview ended with him basically bawling me out on the air. And a lot of times the more hostile guests, they very quickly understand what they've gotten themselves into. Who did we just interview? The guy who he was. I kept asking him about abortion. He's like, "Do you have any other subject you want to talk about?"
Oh, that was it was Evangelicals for Harris, the guy running Kamala Harris' campaign to get Christians to vote for it.
Okay,
yeah, and he was not. Yeah, that one turned.
I just went through all of Harris's
He was
position,
nice, but he's just like, is that all you want to talk about? Is abortion?
Yeah, but they start to realize, oh, this isn't just some sort of puffball interview that I'm doing here.
Yeah.
And I'm not, and in his case, my typical line of, well, people who support Kamala Harris have all different viewpoints. So it's a big umbrella. So some of them are against abortion, some of them are for abortion. It wasn't going to fly. That would fly with any other interview, like a news interview. But I'm like, yes, but what do you do with the Bible passages that, like, you shall not kill? What do you do with the historic position of Christianity that opposes abortion and call yourselves evangelicals for Harris? And given the fact that this is her only issue after she started running for president. And he just did not want to answer that question.
And we got that interview. I mentioned it's harder with the internet now because publicists can do research.
That's why we've never been able to interview Joel Osteen.
Why would Elaine Pagels, the big perpetuator of the Gnostic Gospels, why is she going to come on with us and not NPR? You know what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
It's like, because they're going to toss their softballs. Like, oh, that's just amazing. And we're not going to toss their softballs. So the thing with Evangelical Harris, the publicist didn't do his homework. So the only way we get these people on is the publicist.
He got fired after that interview.
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
So sometimes you guys just sneak in there, right?
Well, yeah. And we're not lying to him. We send him, here's our website. Here's where there are.
He sends the same email to every publicist, and with all our links, if they want to track us down, they can track us down.
I mean, I just say Todd Wilken. I don't say LCMS pastor.
Mm-hmm.
Todd Wilken. I always put like the big name people, like I'm executive producer. It makes it sound like we got this big staff.
Yeah.
It's just me, But like the LCMS people, I just say Jeff Schwarz, producer. But the big name people, executive producer, like, oh boy, they must have like this whole production staff.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So that's probably a little bit dishonest. I repent.
But you are rejected.
Rude as a serpent.
Yeah. I guess I am. But it's harder now with the internet because the publicists can do their research.
Mm-hmm.
But another one surprised on the 500th anniversary of Reformation, Elizabeth Eaton, the presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, agreed to an interview with us.
How'd that one go?
And it was profound. I mean, Todd can tell you more about it. Todd do a better job. She was very vague until we got specific, and Todd can take it from there.
And so she knew that she was interviewing a Lutheran pastor, so she did her very best to sound as Lutheran as possible.
Mm.
And that's one of the features of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is they've retained all the language.
Word and sacrament.
Yeah, they've retained all
gospel.
of the jargon, but they've changed all the definitions.
Mm.
So she was kind of counting on skating by just hoping that I didn't ask her to define anything. And the most telling point in that interview is the last question, where I said, in my denomination, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, I'm sure you know, the pastors and congregations are required to subscribe unconditionally to the 1580 Book of Concord. That's a requirement. And as a true exposition of Scripture, confessional subscription. I just gave her that definition. I said, is that a requirement in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America? I knew the answer to that. I knew no, it isn't at all. Her answer was very telling. She said, yes, we require all of our pastors to subscribe to the Lutheran confessions as a true exposition of the gospel. She swapped out Scripture for the gospel. And it's a classic move of gospel reductionism, is to say, I will subscribe to them as expositions of the gospel. That way I can narrow everything down and reject what I don't like.
Uh-huh.
But she would not say Scripture. And that little move was the highlight of that interview, because up to that point, and when we did a postmortem on it with, I don't know who we talked to, when we did a postmortem on it, we always do postmortems after the hospital interviews with someone else. I said, you could have listened to almost that entire interview and think, wow, we've got the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America all wrong. They really are Lutherans after all, until you get to that answer. But then it takes someone to explain what she did there, how she basically, in theological terms, swapped the formal and material principles of theology out for one another. And once the lay people see, she wouldn't say Scripture, she'd say the gospel, then the mask comes off.
Then it makes sense.
Yeah.
Did you have any pushback, or did that one get hostile at all?
I thought she was pretty cordial.
Yeah.
I think
they are. I mean, basically, Elka Lutherans are Episcopalians, and so they're nothing but polite.
Yeah,
they're very polite.
I don't think she'll ever. We'll never get another interview with her again.
So, what would be your thoughts for our setting here at a long form? Like, because we've wrestled with that a little bit of, is there value in having more of a, if you want to call it like a hostile, like if we were to bring on a representative from the ELCA and sit here in the long form, and what would be your thoughts on that kind of setting?
You got to be really prepared.
That'd be my concern.
You absolutely have to know where you're going.
Yeah.
And
I'd rather host somebody else that really knows their stuff.
Don Matz had always said you have to be like a lawyer. You don't ask a question you don't know the answer to.
Yeah.
So if you don't do that kind of prep, it's
we prep more for those interviews than for anything else. And we will actually, I'm not trying to tell any out of school things, but Jeff will send out emails to all the experts, guests that we have in that subject, and say, what would you ask them if you had the opportunity to ask them?
That's really good.
So
we take
the
those
questions like when we did
together.
Evangelicals of Harris, I sent out all the people that we deal on Christianity and culture, LCMS, non-LCMS, and then we pare it down, these questions, because, and of course, a couple will be ours, but why?
Yeah.
And we don't, if you had a research staff that could do all that stuff, that's fine, but why? And these people, they love what we do, and they're like, sure. And I mean, they'll just send 5 or 6 questions.
So much of your success is really the networking and the relationship.
It's the stuff under the surface of the ocean. The actual broadcast is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
what makes that happen is all the footwork that gets done before the show before the mic ever turns on.
Yeah.
And it's either prepped by me or prepped by Jeff, or we're sitting down and talking about it. And we spend a lot of time, even with friendly interviews. We're going to try and get Mark Hemingway on to do his analysis of the Trump inaugural celebration and the first couple days. And Mark will not read the questions because he's too busy. But Jeff will say, "Did you get the questions we sent you?" And he'll say, "Yeah, but I haven't looked at them." And which is fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
We don't send all the guests the questions.
No, but
it's for our benefit.
It's for our benefit.
We're dealing something, he's a theologian. Now you're talking left-hand kingdom stuff.
So we'll sit down and we will formulate questions that we want to get everything in there, because Mark's going to give us a half hour at the most.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got to let him go. So we will do that to make it as efficient as possible.
Yeah.
And then, and you do that because you don't want to waste the listener's time at all. You want to get everything in that you can.
Mm.
So,
but that doesn't mean every drive home when the show's over with, it runs live 3 to 5. I don't think of, well, we should ask this. We should have, and that's my drive, 20-minute commute home. I didn't ask this, you idiot.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break, and then I want to dive into the 08 controversy.
Okay. Soup.
All right. And executive producer Bennett says that we are back. Let's jump into the 08 controversy. Take this opportunity to kind of walk through those details for all the people that, saw it from afar.
So
we knew we were going to get fired eventually.
Yeah.
It was going to happen.
Leading up to 08.
Oh yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah. We knew that the head leadership at the time was not a big fan of the show.
And to clarify, this time you're owned by the Synod.
We're under the auspices of the Missouri Synod, working for KFUO, which is the oldest full-time Christian radio station in the country, owned and operated by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And so we knew that the president at the time, Gerald Kieschnick, was not a fan. Now, he didn't listen, but we were, let's Yankee Stadium. The whole prayer controversy where a district president prayed with Oprah and Hindus and all that kind of stuff. So obviously we were opposed to that, interfaith prayer services. But we get a memo, you can't talk about Yankee Stadium.
Mm.
Well, we're like, okay, we'll figure,
there's a workaround.
Spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. Yeah. So we just do Albert Mohler and interfaith prayer services. Didn't say anything about Yankee Stadium.
Yeah.
Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Was he praying with these? We came up with ideas, to talk about it without mentioning Yankee Stadium. So we were at odds with the leadership at the time on that issue right away in 2001 when President Kieschnick's elected. And then we had, whether it's worship, communion practice, role of women in the church. We weren't in line. We weren't in lockstep with the current leadership on issues like that. So the general manager at KFUO called us in, and I was trying to think this morning when it happened. The 2007 LCMS convention was going to happen. Now, the Board for Communication Services that oversaw KFUO, we had a confessional Lutheran majority on that board up until 2007.
Mm.
And he brought us in, I don't remember how many months in advance for 2000. He goes, look, there's a good chance that there's not going to be a confession. That board's going to change. And when it do, they're going to get rid of issues, et cetera.
Mm.
So we were tipped off in advance. The irony of the whole thing.
And we asked him at the time, can we go independent? Will you just let us take it?
So
Go independent. He's like, no.
So a couple years earlier, I tried to establish a recognized service organization of the LCMS called Lutheran Public Radio. And all these ideas that we have now with the 24/7 sacred music, all these things. And I remember making the pitch at the International Center, the headquarters of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And the chairman loved it. And Chuck Mansky, the sainted Chuck Mansky of Concordia Irvine, said, this sounds like a great idea. I was like, well, we're going to get RSO status, right? And I was like, well, do you just want me way outside? Because I'm thinking they're going to vote yes, and this is a slam dunk. And the executive director at times said, no, you just go back to KFUO. Didn't hear anything. And then we get this letter in the mail. We've declined RSO status for Lutheran Public Radio. So getting back to all this could have been avoided because we could have just like, hey, we'll just go independent.
Yep.
But the general manager at the time says that's not an option. They're definitely not. They didn't give you back then. They're definitely not going to get you RSO status now
with the new board.
And he said something to the effect of, after this convention, you might have a year. We'll see.
Yeah. And so the amazing thing was the 2007 convention happened. New members on the board for communication services, which oversaw KFUO. But this is July of 2007. We made it all the way to Holy Week, March of 2008. And then we were called, we got a memo, Wilken and Schwarz, come to the International Center, the headquarters, for a meeting. We asked our body, like, what's this meeting about? Like, nobody make eye contact or like, oh, this could be interesting.
So we had three possibilities. We always, you always have to have contingencies. So we thought, one, we're being fired. Two, we're going to get a real talking to. Mm-hmm. Okay. Which is not unusual. We got a lot of talking to. And, what was the third one we thought might be a possibility? Oh, one of our bosses is getting fired. Mm. You never know. We thought maybe one of our bosses is getting fired, and we had a lot of bosses.
Too many.
Yeah. And we thought those are three possibilities. Most likely we are going to be fired. So the minute we walked in, we saw the head of HR and our main boss sitting in there.
Once we saw the head of HR, we knew what was going to happen. The crazy thing about it, we knew it was going to happen. Wilken, because we talked about this in advance, brought a tape recorder.
Yeah.
The whole thing is recorded illegally. But we still have the recording of our firing, which has never aired anywhere.
Do you want to air that right now?
Yeah. Right. Do you still have the recording?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So he went to the bathroom, right? Did you just turn it on right away? I can't remember.
I had it on when I walked in the building.
Yeah. So the whole thing's recorded to this day. Maybe someday when we're in the church triumphant, somebody will listen to it. So when you see the gal that's been head of HR for LCMS for decades sitting there, you pretty much know what's going to happen. And so the head of the board for communication service, like, we're canceling issues, etc.
He wouldn't say you're fired.
Yeah.
He said, we are canceling issues, etc.
Do we have jobs? No.
Yeah.
Are we being fired? No. We're canceling issues, etc.
Therefore, your positions are terminated. That's what he said. Yeah. Your positions are terminated.
Yeah.
And I said, David.
This is David Strand, who was head of the board of communication service at the time. Great man.
Wonderful, kind person. And he was at the time a fellow parishioner. We were at St. Paul de Pere. Mm. He was my elder, in fact.
Oh, wow.
And I said, David, I'm not going to punch you. Just tell us what's happening here. And he, at that point, he was really, he had a hard time doing this. I felt bad for him because he didn't want to do this. Mm-hmm. And he also didn't know what was coming because we said nothing to anybody else about this at the time. And he didn't know what was coming. Our intermediate boss certainly didn't know what was coming. And so he handed it over to Barb, who is the HR person.
Barb Ryan. Right.
And she very formally, she does this all the time. She has to do this terrible job of firing people. And she pushes the files over to us that had our severance package in it. And
now, leading up to this, I had to convince Wilken that this was going to be the playbook. Because I remember telling Todd, like, they're going to try to say we can't say anything negative about the LCMS. And Todd was naive at the time, thinking, they wouldn't do that.
I didn't think there'd be an NDA in there.
Yeah. And I was like, no.
Gag clause.
Gag clause. And it's like, no, it's going to happen. And we've got to be prepared to just say no to their severance packages.
She slid it across, and I said, look, I'm just going to tell you right now, if there's a gag clause in here, I'm not inclined to accept this. And she had never.
Yeah, there's nothing in the HR playbook for not even opening them, not even discussing them. And then she proceeds to say, these are like really, really good severance packages.
And they were.
Schwarz and Pastor
They were very good.
Yeah, we didn't know that at the time, though, because we never opened them. And we just refused to open them and literally left them on the table. And when we're leaving, he's like, take your severances packages with you. No, because if there's anything that's taking away our First Amendment rights, it's a no deal. I don't care how much money you got.
But we knew at the time that there was a possibility of coming back independently. And if we signed the NDA, we would always be beholden to Thompson Coburn, which was at the time was the law firm that represented the LCMS. And just coincidentally, the legal representation for the LCMS from Thompson Coburn was David Strand's wife.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So we knew that if we ever said anything publicly, the LCMS could come after us for it, which is why we said we can't do it.
If you would have accepted that, would you be here today?
No,
I don't think so. I don't think so.
And
well, first of all, what kind of credibility do we have?
Yeah.
We're telling people to be bold confessors of the faith, and then, well, we're not going to be. That's hypocrisy, right? And as a journalist, I'm not going to sell my First Amendment rights to anybody.
Yeah. So I completely understand the reason for NDAs in the regular world, but this was not a position that we were willing to take. So, what we immediately after we left there, and I said to my boss out in the lobby of the International Center, I said, you're going to be taking phone calls about this. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we'll probably take a few.
So the problem in the leadership at the time, they didn't understand the technology. They didn't understand that. They thought we were just a daytime, AM, drive time, 5,000 watt radio talk show.
And we asked them when they fired us, we said, we're supposed to tape an Easter Sunday night show, nationally syndicated show with Dr. Jeff Gibbs.
On the resurrection according to Matthew's gospel.
Can we at least go back and get that thing in the can for them?
We won't say anything about our cancer. We want to get the gospel out. Yeah. One last time. Not even say it's our last show. We promise.
Let's go back.
Let's talk about the resurrection according to Matthew. We don't even tell anybody we got canceled, but it was scheduled at a later date. No, we had to turn in our keys.
You're done today.
We could not go back to our offices, we weren't even allowed clean our desks out. I was like back in Wilken, what did you steal something? Did you download porn? I mean, what? He's probably thinking the same thing of me. Because how could it be this severe?
Yeah.
And they wouldn't even let us go back on this 100-some stations, XM Sirius satellite radio.
They got dead air.
To talk about the resurrection.
They got dead air.
They literally sent nothing and paid for it and paid for the airtime. So, but getting back, they didn't understand the technology, and they since they didn't listen to the show, and who would want to listen to theology, right? Mm-hmm.
That was their mentality, right?
Yeah, that was the mentality. So we would get these top 100 download reports from KFUO, and we were never, the lowest we'd get out of the top, and there's all kinds of other programs at KFUO, the lowest we'd ever be is 95 out of the 100 were our episodes. And there was 1 month where all 100 episodes were ours. Everything being KFUO.
Wow.
So I'd see these downloads, and I'd say, man, I hope somebody's dumb enough to cancel this show. Mm-hmm. I was like, I just hope somebody is dumb enough to do it, because I knew, you're looking at 300,000 downloads a month. I'm thinking, man, we can turnkey this thing, and go full speed ahead and not be held back by, the synodical bureaucracy or leadership at the time.
So we went across the highway to Denny's and called our wives.
You called our pastors. You called Pastor Michael Cum. I called Pastor Will Wheaton, my pastor.
And then we sat for an hour or two just game planning what we were going to do. And we knew by the end of that afternoon on Tuesday that we would be able to, if we could secure some funding, we would be able to come back. Now, the way we thought we were going to pay for it was not the way we ended up paying for it. I'm not going to go into the details, but we did have a donor who was willing to say, hey, we can start you out. But it really was the listeners.
Mm.
The listeners started
the tagline, now only our listeners can cancel us.
Yeah.
So the listeners stepped up. It's kind of like with Musk. You're the media. You're the journalist.
Mm-hmm.
It was I don't want to compare what we did on the scale Elon Musk and X, but yeah, it was it was the listeners. And then what happened too? Let's get back to the technology thing. So here's an example I knew. One of our listeners in Pittsburgh called Dr. Keeshing on Easter Sunday night. We get fired Holy Tuesday, Easter. He actually picked up his cell phone. And he said, Dr. Keeshing, this is Barry from Pittsburgh. He's like, I can't tell you how disappointed I am. Cancel the issue, et cetera. He said, I became a Lutheran listening to issues, et cetera. Well, how do you listen in Pittsburgh? He's like, well, I first found out it on WORD. They have a Sunday night show. And then I listened to 15 hours of their podcast on my iPod. And he says, what's a podcast?
Wow.
So in his defense, in Dr. Keesh's defense, he didn't understand the scope. I think, and he didn't listen. And I think he had area pastors complaining about us and telling him, these people are never going to support you anyway. They're a bunch of old gray-haired people, listen to KFUO a couple hours a day in St. Louis. They're never going to support you anyway.
They called it hate speech.
Yeah, we had a church growth pastor who, and again, KFUO was kind of schizophrenic at the time. You'd see the real face of the Missouri Synod. You have contemporary praise, worship music, and then we come on and do hymn study in the afternoon. And people would always say it was like a different station from 3 to 6, like a switch came on. And I said, well, what you're seeing is the real face of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. But a prominent pastor in St. Louis told the morning show guy, who he was a regular guest as a church growth leader in the St. Louis area. He said, this is 2001 when Dr. Keeshnick elected in the fall. It's like I played golf with Dr. Keeshnick, and what can I do to help your marvelous ministry here in a West County suburb? He literally said, do something about the hate speech in the afternoon on KFUO. And this is hate speech 2001 before people were even talking about hate speech, So I think he got bad advice and bad in his defense. I'm not saying he wouldn't cancel it, but they were ill prepared to what was about to happen. And I remember telling David Stern, like, David, I felt terrible for him. It's like, when we walk out that door, you're going to get a lot of heat. He's like, well, the same thing the gentleman, like, well, we expect to take a phone call or two or email or something. Well, then all of a sudden our show's not on. There's Sunday night there. Easter's like dead air. I mean, they just were not. They did not think this thing through very well.
This was before social media, but there were
blogs.
Blogs
were big.
There were blogs, and then there were whatever. I think at the time they were like very primitive social media where you could go to a certain website and people could post stuff, but there was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. There was none of that stuff. And we told our pastors, and then Whedon
Pastor
had a
Will Wheaton of St. Paul Hamill, who then later became head of worship for the Missouri Synod. Now he hosts a podcast for us called The Word of the Lord Endures Forever.
He had a blog, and he posted
very
something about it.
Yes.
And Paul McCain, who was at CPH at the time, but also had a blog called Cyber Brethren or something, very, in LCMS terms, kind of widely read. And the technology was very rudimentary, but you could still go online and interact with people. And it's just, the news of it spread. My phone started ringing off the hook at, probably 4 o'clock that afternoon. I was getting calls from guests.
I got a phone call. Albert Moore got a hold of my home phone number. The president of Southern Baptist Theological. The president of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod
called me.
And it's like, hey, do you want to come do it for us? Kind of thing. And it's like, this is irony of ironies. Like, these other people aren't even LCMS seem to appreciate what we do more than some people in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And then what happened was, well, first of all, we could never, if we had to rely on terrestrial radio, we would have been out of business in a year. The internet not only created the the
reaction.
Mm-hmm.
But it gave us the podcast, the technology to do this in a more affordable, more accessible way
Mm-hmm.
to thousands more people. So then you had Molly Hemingway. Like at the time, she was just Molly Ziegler. She wasn't married at the time, or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she was. She was Molly Ziegler Hemingway. She still used the Ziegler, of course, with Fox News and the Federalist, right? She writes a column, Radio Silence, in Wall Street Journal.
I read that this morning.
Yeah.
It was great.
So that's free publicity, right?
Yeah.
Aaron Wolf, the Sainted Aaron Wolf Chronicles magazine, wrote about our cancellation.
So,
Gene Edward Veith wrote something in World magazine about our cancellation.
St. Louis Post-Dispatch picked
St.
it
Louis
up.
Post-Dispatch had 3 stories, had a protest of almost 100 people outside the IC protesting the LCMS headquarters.
They were not expecting this,
No,
were they?
no.
Well, and we basically, we shut down we didn't do it. I just went home and sat with my wife and my kids. But within a day or two, the International Center was taking calls about this nonstop.
Mm.
And somebody, I don't know who told us, just said, you guys have shut down. They can't do business over the phone anymore because it's nothing but a bank of lights on their phones.
Wow.
In the
They didn't have the
reception
staff to take all
So
the
did they
phone calls.
rethink this at that point? Like, did they go, oops, like we made a mistake?
Well, I mean, it's kind of hard to do it. First of all, if you disagree with us theologically, I mean, it's not very principled. You're going to go back to your missionalist church growth guys like, hey, got it wrong, took too much heat.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, are they going to have your back in the future? So, you know,
And part of the
we
problem
wouldn't
was
have gone back because I would always say,
No.
I just hope somebody's dumb enough to cancel the show.
But did they ever come back to you with any kind of...
No, but
No?
we took phone calls. I took phone calls from people on the board for communication services that were saying this is a travesty. We did not realize this was going to happen. One
Of course,
the
they
guys,
were in the minority now.
one of the guys who was the chair, who had been the chairman, said, "Is there any way that we can get you guys to come back if we can work this out?" And I said, "No, we no disrespect. We've already got other plans."
Mhm.
And
But that's him speaking.
He
as
was
a
speaking-
minority member of the board
Not
of
on behalf
communications.
of those
Sure,
that
right.
he was just trying to
Exactly. He was
figure
going
out.
to try it.
He was going to try and see if
the
the
flagpole,
try
but
and see
it
if he
wasn't
could
going
fix
to
it.
happen.
But that part of the problem was they did not expect the backlash, and they had prepared nothing by way of a public statement.
Mm.
They just thought this was we're just firing a couple of employees and nothing's going to happen. So they'd prepared no press statement. They prepared nothing for it. They hadn't even really kind of game planned what the response would be in a worst case scenario. What are we going to say?
Mm-hmm.
So they
eventually said programmatic and business reasons. Well, programmatic, we had the goods on podcasts. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and David Strand at the time, I remember trying to get Wilken to find the email. He looked at these downloads and he says, it's clear issues such as ruling the roost on podcast downloads.
because I would send him
at
our
KFO.
download
So
numbers all the time.
programmatic, why would you get rid of your most popular show?
Yeah.
So it wasn't programmatic. So then they have to play the money card, you know, that we were costing them money.
And in the meantime, the lawyers were trying to find some way to make us take the severances.
Mm-hmm.
we'll
And
talk about the lawyer we are.
so we decided eventually that we needed to hire a lawyer just to handle this because we were getting contacted by attorneys for the Synod. Who do we go to? Who's the guy?
Chet Pleben.
Chet Pleben. He was a media attorney, and
He's local St. Louis. And if there's any
he's a sharp.
high profile case, police brutality, Chet Pleben is going to be on the news.
And that meeting could itself have been a sitcom because we're sitting with his assistants and a couple of his paralegals in this room, and he comes walking in, and he's a big deal. And
I love what Wilken said. I'm glad you're my attorney and not my pastor.
but he said, he comes in and he says, first of all, do you want me to pursue wrongful termination? Because if so, I need a check for $50,000 from each of you right now. And we're like, no, that's not going to happen. And plus, we didn't have a case. I mean, what they did was completely legal.
Yeah.
It was stupid, but it was legal. And he said, I'll deal with the attorneys from now on. And he did.
And we did have to pay him thousands. I don't remember how much. We paid him up front, at least $10,000, I think.
between the. Oh yes, yeah. And then he this went on for months and months, and finally, one of his assistants called me and said.
Well, they kept giving deadlines and moving them back. We didn't move the deadline. Like this
Who was giving deadlines?
The LCMS legal counsel is saying you got a dedeadline.
You got to.
We just kept like we're not changing. They kept moving the deadlines back until one day it was on a Friday. It said this is the last.
Yeah, they were threatening to sue us. I got the letter hanging on my office wall. They threatened to sue us if we didn't accept the severances.
Yeah,
and our attorney said that's nonsense. He said, and. What Chet did was at their final deadline, and they said, "If after this, we're going to take legal action against you," because we wouldn't take their money. And Chet said, "Fine, I will hold a press conference
on Monday.
This
is Friday afternoon."
And he's famous for doing this with media people, where he just calls a press conference and tells his story.
So I'll have KMWX of the big 50,000 clear channel station, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, probably all three ABC, CBS, NBC, local TV affiliates there. And I'll tell them how your church body treats its employees and how they fire people during Holy Week, one of their holy, seasons.
And they folded and I remember I was picking up my daughter from school.
She hung up and she said, or whoever it was said, and I don't even think it was Chet at the time. I think it was his assistant that was working. It's like, no, I'll check with him one last time. We said, no, we're not rolling over on these severance packages. Those are gag clause. And he's like, okay, that's over. But then when they threatened to deal with the media, then they thought about it a little bit, right? And they called back and said, we got a deal.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so that press conference never took place, but it was the pressure, and that's what caused it.
And I remember I was picking up my daughter from school, and Chet's assistant called me, and he said, they folded like a cheap tent. And he said, you're getting the severance, and there's no gag clause.
Really? So you ended up getting the severance in the end?
Yes. Yeah.
Never happened in the LCMS before. And
that we know of.
Yeah, that we know of. We wouldn't know anyway.
Right. But then... So now we've talked to a couple major donors to get some funding in place, and then we know we're coming back, right? And the great thing about the technology, and our opponents didn't understand, we didn't need towers and all this stuff to do what we do. So we contacted Congressman John Shimkus in Collinsville, Illinois. He's an LCMS in the U.S. House of Representatives at the time. He's a regular guest on the show. He hooked up with his landlord, got really cheap rental office complex. Bought $25,000, $30,000 worth of equipment.
Wow, yeah.
Had it all up. So we get fired in March, and we come back on June 30th. In the meantime, Chris Roseborough of Fighting for the Faith, our listeners reckon, he comes on This Week in Pop Christianity. He helped us put a business plan together because he has had business background. He's got an MBA from Pepperdine. So we put the business plan together, and we were thinking of names because we assumed they had a trademark on issues, etc., right? And Fighting for the Faith was one of them we were going to use, which ended up being Chris's podcast or video blog or whatever.
So we assumed they had a trademark on the name, issues, etc., and we had a longtime listener who was an attorney in Chicago.
No, yeah, well, but my wife's at the Mayo Clinic. She's sick at the time. And again, thanks to the internet, you can go into the patent office and type something in. See, it's trademark. So I'm sitting there on waiting to appointment issues, etc. And in 98, the Synod let the trademark lapse. Well, that's when Don Matzett, we didn't talk about Don Matzett left in 98, and Todd Wilken became the host. So the people at the time who couldn't stand Don Matzett or the show, well, we need to cancel the show because it was really all about Don, even though it was primarily guests. All of a sudden, they loved Don Matzett. Like, we can't keep this going, And we had to fight to keep the show going when Don left, because they were literally trying to get rid of it back in 98. But Wilken takes over, does a great job. So then, as Todd said, we had a Harry Madsen, the sainted Harry Madsen. He's a retired attorney and CPA in Greater Chicago. He actually, if you look at the Articles of Incorporation for Willow Creek, it's Bill Hybels, somebody else, and Harry Madsen was the attorney to incorporate Willow Creek, one of the largest mega churches in South Barrington, Illinois.
Okay.
But he became Lutheran listening to our show.
Okay.
So he swoops in for the trademark for issues, etc. It was like, Harry, it looks to me like this thing's open. And he swoops in the trademark. Well, then tell him what happens from there.
Well, then we started getting more calls from the lawyers saying, we understand that some guy, we want the trademark back. Synod wanted the trademark back, and some guy has procured it. In the meantime, this Harry Madsen. I said, yeah, he did it for us.
Yeah. And
they started this long, convoluted legal wrangling where eventually we're meeting with the Synodical Board of Directors.
Well, representatives.
Yeah.
But before that happened, all of a sudden now the issues, etc. name's important to them. They canceled the show. They fired us, and they were taking master digital audio tape at the time. You probably don't even know, you're too young to this, but that's like the highest quality recording you had. They're like little, like smaller than cassettes. It gives you high quality. They literally, of our Sunday Night National, threw them in the dumpster at KFUO. We don't have the master recordings. Now, these same people are telling us this is so valuable to us.
Yeah.
And they're throwing recordings away. I mean, the irony of ironies. And so now we want this trademark. It's our trademark. So now we're in a trademark dispute. And then, but the problem they had then was we just came back with issues, et cetera, because we're like, we think we're on solid ground and make them come after us again, right? Uh-huh. So now we're on the air. We come back June 30th, and it's like LCMS is after us again.
Yeah.
Here's the board of directors, LCMS. Let them know. Mm-hmm. Well, then they're like, what's going on here? And then the Saint Herb Miller, who was Sutherland District President at the time, mm-hmm. and represented the board of directors, met us at Good Shepherd to have a reconciliation meeting on the trademark, right?
Yeah. And the board of directors who handles all these things, that's their job. They have fiduciary responsibility for the synod. They're like, what's going on here? They'd been fed this line from the attorneys, and they're like, this Harry Madsen, we got to get it back from Harry Madsen. We'll take it and we'll give it to you. We'll take the trademark and we'll give it to you.
But they put the same gag clause in order to get the trademark, the same verbiage, taking away our First Amendment rights, mm-hmm. in order to get the name, issues, et cetera, back.
So they wanted to
change the wording.
So they wanted it back in order to hang that again as something that would cause you to do the gag clause.
Well, that was part of the carrot.
They showed
we
us
had
that.
to. And here we are again fighting the same issue all over again. We'll do you a favor, but you got to sign this, and literally did not even change the verbiage on the gag clause.
Do you think their motivation at this point is they're trying to they just don't want the story of what they did going out? Is that the main thing? Or is it that they just want to undermine and destroy what you're doing?
The board of directors, the people we met with were not hostile to this at all.
Okay.
They just were trying to figure out what was going on. And they'd only heard the attorney side of
And the attorney side was that we don't know who this guy is, and we want to give it to them.
Mm.
But we don't know who this guy is. So they're like,
but the attorneys also wanted the gag clause back in
exactly. They didn't let I don't think the board of directors knew that. But
they showed me the file with the agreement that the attorneys had written up before our meeting, and I said, "This is the NDA that we didn't sign. You're asking us to sign this again. Well, what is that? I don't know. That's what that is. This is the very same NDA." And we basically said no, and Harry was not having any of it. I mean, he was. So eventually we said, look, Harry is holding this. He is, at the time he had incorporated it, and he was the chairman of the board of Lutheran Public Radio. That's our corporation. He's the guy that you have to deal with. And I think eventually what happened.
Well, the board of directors was great once they heard our side of the story. They're like, well, we don't want to fight this. They're like, we got enough bad publicity. We don't need to fight this thing all over again. And now, at least in the initial one, we're not even on the air.
Yeah.
Now we're back up with the podcast with new listeners who heard about us in the Wall Street Journal or Chronicles Magazine or World Magazine. We have a listenership we didn't even have when we were at KFUO.
Wow.
And so now they're like, we could just turn on a switch and say, Synod's coming after us. We didn't have that luxury before. We had to go through other people to get our story out.
But eventually we got a letter from Thompson Coburn saying we're dropping this with prejudice, which legally means we will legally not revisit this subject again.
Okay.
So they basically said, we have promised the court we will never seek to get that copyright.
So was that the
Again.
closing of that chapter? Like at
Yeah.
that point,
Yeah, I think that's
you guys were on your
See,
own
that was
there.
our last dealings with Synod until Matt Harrison was elected, and then the whole thing changed entirely. And then my senior pastor, who was Michael Cumm at the time, was elected to the board of directors of Synod, and that's when Harrison and Michael Cumm kind of started working toward, can we get them back on the air on KFUO, and what's it going to take? And that was a series of other meetings. And as Jeff said earlier, we walked into, I remember sitting in Harrison's office, and he said, we'd like to have you guys back on KFUO in your regular time slot.
He said, we need to right or wrong.
Yeah, and he said, what's it going to cost us? And Jeff said, that's not how it works. We buy airtime from you.
Right.
And
we wanted to buy airtime because we wanted to be independent from the Synod. And I said, President Harris, someday we might want to say something critical about you.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to 2010, Molly Hemingway called it the Issues Etc. Convention. What that did was it galvanized a lot of people who didn't know what was going on in the Missouri Synod. Were kind of complacent, apathetic. A lot of pastors, confessional guys were like, well, we're not going to get rid of the current leadership till you retire, so I'm just going to hunker down in my congregation.
Mm-hmm.
But then you cancel this thing with tens of thousands of listeners. Now they're activated.
Yep.
And Molly Hemingway jokes it. I refer to the 2010 convention as the Issues Etc. convention. People who are regular guests on our show were winning all kinds of, like Michael Cumm, who had been affiliated with us for a long time. He's the voice of Issues that does all our liners and stuff. Those guys were winning at the LCMS convention, and President Harrison defeated President Kieschnick at the time. And truth be told, we were all, I take note, we completely did whatever we could to make sure Matt Harrison.
well, we said at the time,
But you can do that when you're independent.
we said at the time,
we could have never done that. Obviously, we're still in the. Obviously, you can't do.
we got fired and came back in 2008. The convention was in 2010. And I said, if all we do is stay on the air for 2 years and help get Matt Harrison elected president of Synod, we will have done our job.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to see theological change in the Synod. That's what we wanted. We wanted the kind of the church growth, theology light, barely Lutheran identity that
ablaze,
that the synodical leadership had been working towards so hard. We wanted to see that direction change. And I have people criticize, politics has no place in the church, and I completely disagree.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be honest. We have to be transparent. But politics is just how people get things done. It's just how groups of people make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't want politics in the church, don't hold a convention. Don't vote for your leaders. That's politics. And it's not necessarily a bad word. And so I had no qualms of conscience about saying, I'm going to endorse Matt Harrison for president of Synod and telling people why. And so after that, our relationship with Synod, it was like night and day. It changed. And we started buying airtime on KFUO. And it's really, I don't want to downplay the good people over there, but it's really a very small percentage. We've run the numbers on local listening. It's a very small percentage of our listeners. And plus the vast majority of our listeners are on demand anyway.
On the podcast side.
Yeah. And so we still, as I was saying a little earlier, we still run a network clock basically for our radio affiliates. But since we have come back, we don't think of ourselves as a radio show anymore, even though we use the word radio.
Uh-huh.
We think of ourselves as a podcast on demand listeners. And that's, who was it? I was explaining it to one of the members of the board for communication services when he was asking about what's this podcasting stuff you guys are talking about. For free, we can reach the entire world with our show,
Mhm.
as opposed to spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy airtime on terrestrial affiliates
Christian radio affiliate.
and having a much, much smaller audience.
Mhm.
Is the world it was the right place at the right time where the technology fell into place to say it's not going to cost, it does cost a lot of money, but for free, essentially, anyone can listen any place, anytime. And I remember he had a hard time. How does that work? How do people pick it up? And, this was an old guy who wasn't familiar with the internet or any of the technology that was coming along at the time.
It's a DVR for radio. That's the best way. Older audiences. Do you have a DVR that records things? Yeah, it's DVR for radio. That's what a podcast is.
You can just listen to anything.
Let me ask you this. So, maybe check your humility at the door a little bit with this. But like, what would things in the Synod have gone the direction they did? Both with like Matt Harrison, but then, we've talked about this where there's definitely a return to confessionalism, within the Synod. Does that take place if issues, etc., shuts down and does not go back on the air?
I think it takes place by a different means, but I
think our seminaries were really doing a good job for decades. Both seminaries training pastors.
Yeah,
that I think our pastors we were cranking out more and more confessional pastors. Where a lot of the older guys, not all the older guys, but some were still Seminex sympathizing.
Very true. Yeah,
sympathizers were going off the rolls, and they were replaced with younger, more confessional guys. So I think from the pastor's perspective, I think it would have happened. But ours is we're about lay people.
Yeah.
So we were able to combine the laity, confessional laity, with confessional pastors. So I think it probably would have come about.
But maybe
slower.
Kind of two sides to the coin, right?
I'll get particular. If we had not been canceled, I'm convinced of this, then Gerald Kieschnick would have won what would have been a fifth term in 2010. Because
fourth term.
A fourth term in 2010. He might still be synodical president today because, and this is a little technical, the restructuring that he did during his last two terms of Synod was just phase one. There was a plan to move on to phase two and basically make every congregation just an affiliate of LCMS. That it would have just greatly reduced the districts. They were planning essentially to rewrite all the district lines. And
I think the bigger issue was they were going to give more congregational representation to bigger congregations. If that had happened, we would not see the Missouri Synod today. If the bigger congregations, rather than an electoral college kind of approach, a popular vote, for lack of a better term, just because the bigger churches have more people, had that happened, rather than one vote per congregation, things would have been different.
Very, very different.
We might not be here today.
What do you think his motivation was for doing that?
Well, I got to hand it to Gerald Kieschnick. He's a political genius. And he is. He knows how to accomplish things. And so I cannot speak to his motivation in any way whatsoever. He had a picture of the Missouri Synod that was, I think, probably far more favorable to entities like the ELCA. Theology was not a huge priority for him. I think he kind of thought it got in the way of the mission. And so I think he could have, if he wanted to, have remained as, had he been given the chance to implement the next phase of restructuring, he could either remain as synodical president for life, or, because that's just the political reality, if he had the larger congregations pouring in votes for him. And or he could have easily chosen his successor to continue that path.
Yeah.
It would have looked very, very different. I'm not saying that the cancellation of issues, et cetera, would have, in a political sense, I think it would have meant Jerry Kieschnick is elected in 2010. Does that mean Matt Harrison's never elected? No. but it would have happened by a different means, I think. Because and it would have come from the lay people. But what would have happened in that case, and I can't speak completely to hypotheticals, I think it would have been, had Jerry Kieschnick been reelected in 2010, a lot of confessional Lutheran congregations would have left the Synod. My own congregation at the time was planning to do it.
Really? Yeah.
We had already made preparations to say we're done. And I don't know how many. Maybe, I mean, I think if I was being generous, I'd say a third, but probably not that much. So the Synod would look a lot different these days. All this was, it was just a dumb decision taken by the then leadership of the Missouri Synod that had bigger consequences than they could have anticipated. And so, and we were just along for the ride.
What's the old adage? Like, what is it? Keep your enemies
close.
Your friends close.
Your friends close, enemies close.
Yeah. And I mean, as long as we were under the LCMS, we were limited in what we do.
Yeah.
Now, trust me, we were talking about worship. We were talking about communion practices. We were talking about the service of women in the church, but we were still couldn't be too specific, like put LCMS names to those things.
Yeah.
We could talk about evangelism, but we couldn't talk about Ablaze, the big evangelism program at the time. There were certain things we couldn't say. So by keeping us under their thumbs, obviously this is hindsight.
Yeah.
They had a little more control. Now they have no control.
It almost seems like this is just kind of a symptom of underestimating the kind of conservative and confessional nature of the Synod.
Yeah.
Right? Like they underestimated you guys. They didn't think that you had the presence you did, that they didn't think you had the listeners you did. But it seems like that was probably just one aspect of a larger picture where they were underestimating what the LCMS really was. And they were kind of blinded perhaps by, I wasn't plugged in during this time frame, right? But it seems like those kind of movements have a certain naivety of what the people, why people are part of the Lutheran Church, what it is, and they kind of become intoxicated with change, So it seems like you guys were kind of a microcosm of that larger picture.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of describing it. I think also underestimating the lay people in the Missouri Synod, because on some issues, if you just did a general survey of our lay people, we'd be very, very disappointed in terms of theology. But on others, especially for the ones who identify with confessional Lutheran congregations, we have a very well catechized, very activated laity. And in a political sense, that's what they didn't anticipate in that 2010 convention. They didn't realize these lay people are going to actually show up at their circuit forums. Then they're going to show up and they're going to get themselves elected as a delegate, and they're going to show up and they're going to vote. Because if you look at the votes of that convention, you mentioned Molly calling it she called it the Issues Etc. revolution.
Yeah, that's
because boards, these things nobody even knew or cared about that you vote on, all these were being populated with confessional Lutherans. And it also helped activate congregations because they started nominating people for those positions. And to take nothing away from Matt Harrison, he has had the benefit of kind of riding that wave, convention after convention, politically, of being able to count on lay delegates nominating the right people and then coming and voting for the right people.
But it's also a case, and I see this with the younger confessional guys, like, synodical politics, left-hand kingdom stuff. I don't want to get involved in that. It's the system we have.
Yeah.
Now, you either change that system, our former church governors or whatever you want to do, or you've got to work within that system, which means you got to take part in the process, which means you've got to be able to serve on boards or nominate lay people to serve on boards, which means you have to write convention resolutions. That's the system we have now. And one of the things I first was more younger guys like, that's left-hand kingdom stuff. Stay out of it. No, learn from this.
Yeah.
You've got to be engaged. If you care and love for our church, its doctrine, its practice, this is the system we have. So don't sit on the sidelines.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. We got about maybe 5 minutes that are running up till noon, and I know you guys have recordings and such going on. And what's your hope for kind of the future of Lutheran media, let's call it, confessional Lutheran media? How do you want those things to look, in the next decade?
Are you talking about us or just
in general?
larger?
Yeah, in general. Yeah.
Well, I mean, here's the deal. There is no excuse for a layperson to say, I don't understand that anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've told you we've got a daily 15-minute verse-by-verse Bible study called The Word of the Lord Endures Forever, hosted by Will Whedon. Just goes through verse by verse. And that came about, it's like, how come we had these older people? It's like, I listened to Chuck Swindoll and J. Vernon McGee and Charles Stanley. And I'm like, okay, we're the Sola Scriptura people. And these guys are just doing expository teaching. Why are we not doing this? Right. Yeah. So Whedon's going to 15 minutes every day. What you're doing, what we do in issues, etc. We have a 24/7 sacred music station. There are more resources now to cast God's word out. Thanks be to God, the internet. Even though sinners that we are, we abuse it in terrible ways as well. What a great opportunity right now to get God's word out in as many media platforms, whether it's video with you. We've published 5 books. We've got radio talk shows. We've got podcasts. We've got a 24/7 sacred music station. We just need to be multimedia.
Yeah, yeah.
And terrible, the fact that I chose Lutheran Public Radio as a corporate name was just stupidity, because radio is virtually almost nothing that we do. And we're eventually planning on changing that because we know we have to be multimedia. I saw this when I was in secular sports talk stations. What was happening with advertisers is they just didn't want to buy radio. Mm-hmm. They wanted a multifaceted, they wanted print and radio. They wanted, so if you had more avenues for advertising, so we would trade out with Inside Sports Magazine at the time. We get 2 full page ads in your thing, and do it, so when you advertise on Coast to Coast, we'll also get you a print. So you saw what was happening with ad agencies. Like, we don't want to just, it's more time consuming too. I got to buy the radio by here and a print by here and a TV by here. So the more multimedia you were, the more these people were going to gravitate towards advertising with you. So getting back multimedia, we've got to get out as many God's word in its purity through our Lutheran doctrine and practice, as many vehicles as possible.
When we started podcasting, we had no competition in the Lutheran sphere, and absolutely no competition in the secular sphere, because we started that early. And fast forward to 2025, everybody has a podcast. Mm-hmm. Celebrities have podcasts. I just heard Conan O'Brien say he wished he would have discovered podcasting before, because he's actually getting to do what he really wants to do in terms of his media, that he was constrained by network executives and producers and stuff like that. Now he's doing what he really wants to do. So a lot of people have discovered that medium, and everybody and their dog has a podcast. I bet you if you went to the average congregation, not the congregation. If you went to the average district convention and just asked the pastors assembled there, how many of you have a podcast? Almost all of them would raise their hands, because the technology is so easy to use now. And everybody thinks they have something to say. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the downside of this is you can have a podcast, but isn't anybody interested in what you have to say, which is why we remain guest driven.
Well, that's our thought too. I think we talked about this before, but I don't think I could do a 2-hour podcast on my own. I don't think I have many things on my own that's worth people listening to, which is why if you have guests, that's probably 80% of our content is whatever guests we have on. But the 20% where I speak, it's always because someone else has said something where a light bulb goes off. Yeah. I would have never pre-planned that or anything.
Exactly. Like and so there's going to be a winnowing at some point where instead of just handing a USB mic to every child who's born in the U.S. and say, you've got a podcast too, there's going to be the cream is market forces. The cream will rise to the top. Mm-hmm. There'll always be the guy doing his podcast from his basement who thinks he has a giant audience and he doesn't. That's why we always look at numbers. Numbers don't lie. Yep. And they tell you a lot. And
what was that convention? It was a national podcast convention. We went one year. What was it? I can't remember what it was called. We went
and
to
it
Dallas.
had at the time the biggest names.
Yes. And we went to, so like, what, we wanted to learn something, right? Like,
we traveled down there.
We traveled down there, but what we saw were middle-aged men didn't like their jobs, and some with tinfoil hats.
Yeah.
Wanting to look at a new career.
I was convinced we were going to be able to go to these seminars that were being run by at the time, the biggest names, the host. I date myself because the podcast world broke open with the serial podcast from former NPR producers about serial crime. And then everybody and all the NPR producers started jumping ship and starting their own podcasts. And once they were able to monetize it, it was Katie bar the door. And so they were, I went down there, and Roman Mars, who at the time had a podcast, maybe still does, called 98% Invisible. It's a podcast about design. And that sounds very dry.
It does, yeah.
But it's a great podcast.
Okay.
Very well produced. And here he is up on the stage. He's got a convention center full of people. And I'm thinking, I'm going to learn these secrets that this guy has somehow figured out. And when he was done, I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I was like, we're already doing all of this.
Yeah.
And we went back to my dad's house at the time, and I'm like, he's like, did you learn anything? And I'm like, nothing that we aren't already doing.
I mean, I was trying to take notes.
Yeah.
I just like,
and it's not because we're smart.
Notes.
It's not because we're smart. It's just because we've been doing it so long.
And we made all the mistakes that they talked about. Trial
so
and error.
there will be a winnowing. The cream will rise to the top. And my hopes for the Lutheran presence in podcasting is that it remains genuinely, distinctly Lutheran.
Mm-hmm.
That we actually, that it isn't Lutheranism, which is my term for kind of taking the things you like best out of Lutheranism. And
no, Martin Luther.
Yeah.
Or just Luther.
Yeah, for Martin Luther. And calling yourself a Lutheran, that we are able to combat the errors that always plague Lutheranism, that kind of ride along on the sides like barnacles. That we are, as Jeff was saying earlier, that we reach Lutheran lay people and tell them being Lutheran isn't what Garrison Keillor of Prairie Home Companion told you it was. It isn't liking casseroles and singing hymns slowly. It is the distinct Christian voice in the world. There are a lot of Christian voices in the world, but they're all many of them are confused and muddled and mixed with other things. I believe with all my heart that the Scripture and the Confessions present historic, apostolic Christianity full force, full proof. And it is a message that has an incredible learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easily accessible. But the technology exists now to have that message in the world where people get to hear the message of Christ crucified for sinners in its undiluted form. And a robust view of God's word that takes every syllable seriously. And all we got to do is pick up the technology that now will cost you, a couple $100, or in our case, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to do at our level, and put it out there. It is. It's akin to when terrestrial radio actually began, and the visionary of a guy like Walter A. Meyer, the first Lutheran Hour speaker, realizing, I can get behind a microphone once a week and preach, and people all over the country will be able to hear me. And he just realized the potential of the medium. And while that medium has waned, this one has become ascendant, and it's exactly the same opportunity.
I would add one caveat to that. Our goal is to get our listeners into faithful confessional Lutheran churches.
Yeah.
That is our ultimate goal. That's why we don't call ourselves a ministry. You don't hear us talk about ministry.
I'm not anybody's pastor except the people at Trinity Millstadt.
We try to tell people, Wilken is not your pastor. We want to you like what you hear, you want to hear more of it, go visit your local LCMS church. That's really what we're about. We're trying to take our listeners into faithful confessional Lutheran congregations around the world.
And people will be like, oh man, I just love Issues, Etc. I can't get enough of it. And I was like, well, you know that 2 miles away from where you live, there's a faithful Lutheran pastor doing this every Sunday, and he would be more than happy to see you show up. So that if you can't get enough Issues, Etc., you haven't really seen yet what you're thirsting for. We're giving you a taste of it. Your pastor can give you the full meal. So, yeah.
Hey, Jeff and Todd, this was great.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you
much
for the time.
enjoyed
Keep up
this.
the great work.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Appreciate
Yeah.
it.
God bless.